Dim light poured through the stained-glass windows of the orphanage, where a couple stood, Richard and Catherine Davis. They had been unable to have children for a long time, and now this was their chance. The director brought them a boy, a blonde child with piercing, almost black eyes. "This is Damien," she said gently. "A calm boy. He hardly ever cries." Richard felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he met the child's gaze. Something unsettled him, but he couldn't explain what exactly. The first signs a few weeks had passed since Damien became part of their family. At first, everything seemed perfect. The boy was obedient, rarely fussy, and almost always smiling, but something was off. Catherine began to notice strange things. Toys moved on their own, mirrors became covered in web-like cracks without any visible cause, and the dog, which had always been friendly, now bared its teeth and growled at the boy, stepping back whenever he approached. Richard laughed it off, trying to find a rational explanation. "It's just a coincidence," he assured his wife when she told him she had found Damien's cradle rocking in the middle of the night, though no one was in the room. But soon coincidences were no longer just coincidences. The first death, Damien's birthday. Guests are laughing, music fills the living room, and Catherine is cutting a large chocolate cake. At that moment, their nanny, a young girl named Laura, steps out onto the second-floor balcony. "For you, Damien!" she shouts, and before anyone can understand what is happening, she jumps down, crashing onto the stone courtyard. A dead silence falls. Everyone is frozen. Damien only smiles. Richard looks at his son and feels something terrifying. His boy is not afraid. There is no horror in his eyes, no sorrow, only emptiness. Laura's funeral took place 3 days later. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy, like black velvet. Catherine could barely stand, her face pale, almost bloodless. "Why did she do it?" she whispered, clutching her husband's hand. Richard didn't know how to answer. This question tormented him as well. Laura had been a joyful girl, and nothing had forewarned of tragedy. But what disturbed him the most was Damien, his behavior that day. During the funeral, the boy watched the ceremony with an expressionless face. No tears, not even a shadow of sorrow. And when the coffin was lowered into the ground, he smiled. The first dream. That night, Richard had a dream. He stood in a dark corridor, long and grim, where dim red light flickered. Ahead was a door. He opened it and saw Damien. The boy sat on the floor, surrounded by hissing snakes. His eyes, they were black as an abyss. "You are not my father," Damien said. "You are merely a temporary guardian." Richard woke up in a cold sweat. His heart was pounding furiously. Devilish coincidences. The next day, Richard decided to learn more about Damien's biological parents. The adoption records contained almost nothing. An anonymous mother, an unknown father. But one detail made his heart stop. The boy was born at 6 o'clock in the morning, on the 6th day of the 6th month, 606. Richard swallowed nervously. "It's just a coincidence," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But deep inside he already knew. This was no coincidence. The following day he sought out an old priest, Father Marcus, who had worked in the Vatican for many years. "You must help me," Richard pleaded. "I don't know what's happening, but I'm afraid that my son—" The priest let out a heavy sigh. "If he is who I think he is, you need to prepare for the worst." The priest's gloomy office was filled with ancient books. The scent of wax candles and parchment mixed with the damp decay that seeped into the walls. "You need to know the truth," Father Marcus said, pulling out a heavy, leather-bound book. "There is an ancient prophecy that speaks of the birth of the Antichrist. It mentions a boy born on the day of the sixth seal." Richard felt his fingers grow cold. "You're not suggesting that?" The priest lifted his heavy gaze to him. "Everything points to it, Mr. Davis. You must uncover the truth about his origins, and do it as soon as possible before it's too late." The shadow behind. That night, Catherine woke up to a strange sound. She heard a faint whisper coming from the nursery. Holding back her fear, she approached the door and peeked inside. Damien was sitting on his bed, talking to someone. "I understand," he whispered. "Everything will be as you wish." Catherine felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Damien." Her voice trembled. The boy turned his head sharply, and his eyes, they looked darker than usual. "It's okay, Mom," he said calmly. "You can go back to sleep." But Catherine couldn't sleep. She felt that someone, or something, had already entered their home. The cursed photograph. The next day, Richard met with a journalist who had once investigated cases related to the occult. His name was David Keller. "You say strange events are happening around the boy." The journalist flipped through his notebook. "I've seen this before. Let me take a photo of him." When David developed the film, a cold horror gripped him. In the photograph, behind Damien, stood a dark, blurred figure with a distorted face, frozen in a silent scream. But the most terrifying thing was the shadow on the boy's head, forming the shape of 3 sixes, .666 ... "Oh my God!" He exhaled. A second later, the lights in the office flickered and went out. The lamp burst into a flash and shattered into pieces. David no longer had any doubts. This child was not ordinary. David Keller nervously crumpled the photograph, his fingers trembling. "This can't be real," he muttered. Richard stared at the shattered lamp, feeling the cold seep into his bones. "What do we do now?" The journalist looked up at him. "We need to find out exactly where Damien was born and who his real parents were. I have a contact in the Vatican. He might be able to help. A warning from the grave." Meanwhile, Catherine was at home trying to hide her fear. She could no longer look at Damien the way she used to. Something about him terrified her to the core. She decided to clean out the old attic, hoping to distract herself. Climbing the stairs, she pushed open the heavy oak door. Dust swirled in the air, and among the old belongings she stumbled upon a mirror. And then something horrifying happened. When Catherine looked at her reflection, a figure appeared behind her, a black silhouette with empty eyes. She screamed and recoiled. The mirror cracked. Downstairs, Damien laughed. The road to the truth. Richard and David arrived at the San Pietro monastery in Rome. The priest they met looked troubled. "I knew this day would come," he said. "Many years ago a woman was brought here. She died in childbirth." Richard held his breath. "Who was she?" The priest sighed. She was a follower of a secret cult. They worshipped the one without a name. Richard felt his heart pounding in his chest. And the child, the priest leaned in closer. It was not ordinary. They said it was a gift or a curse. David swallowed hard. Are you saying that Damien, the priest, only made the sign of the cross? If it is him, then you don't have much time left. He is still a child, but the power inside him is already awakening. They didn't know that at that very moment in the US, Catherine stood at the top of the stairs, and a small hand pushed her from behind. She fell. The last thing she saw before crashing onto the marble floor was a dark figure watching her from above. Richard received a call in the middle of the night. Mr. Davis? This is Dr. Graham. Your wife has been in an accident. She's in critical condition. Richard could barely hold the receiver. The world around him swayed. What happened? She fell down the stairs. We did everything we could, but... The doctor paused for a moment, as if unsure how to continue. The baby, she lost the baby. Richard closed his eyes, trying to suppress a scream. They had been waiting for this child. Catherine was 3 months pregnant. When he hung up, David placed a hand on his shoulder. You already know who did this. Richard nodded silently. A meeting with horror. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Catherine in her room. She was pale, her eyes sunken, her voice trembling. He pushed me, Richard. What? Who? Damien. There was something in her eyes beyond fear. It was the understanding of something inevitable. We have to get rid of him, she whispered. Richard didn't know what to say. When he returned home, Damien was already waiting for him in the living room. How's Mom? The boy asked, his voice calm, indifferent. She will live, Richard muttered. That's good. Damien smiled. But you know nothing will change, don't you? Richard froze. What did you say? I said, you can't change what's written in fate. For a moment, Richard thought he saw the boy's eyes flash red. He realized this was no longer just suspicion. This was the truth, and that truth could destroy him. Richard sat in the darkness, feeling the world around him crumble. His wife was on the brink of life and death. His unborn child was gone, and his son, he was not his son. The next morning he met with David in an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of the city. There, waiting for them, was Father Marcus, the old priest from the Vatican. He held a long bundle in his hands. This is the only thing that can stop him, he said, unwrapping the cloth. Inside lay a dagger made of dark metal. The blade was adorned with symbols Richard had never seen before. This is the sacred dagger of Megiddo. It was forged in ancient times to destroy evil. Richard stared at the weapon, and one question pulsed in his mind. Could he kill his own child? You must drive the blade straight into his heart. Only then can you stop him before he becomes too powerful, the priest added. Richard closed his eyes. Did he have a choice? A meeting with the devil? That night he entered Damien's room. The boy was awake. He sat on the edge of his bed as if he had been waiting. I knew you would come, Father, he said in a cold voice. Richard tightened his grip on the dagger. This has to end. Damien laughed. You'll never do it. You're too weak. The lights in the room flickered. Darkness thickened around them, and Richard felt something invisible coil around his throat, squeezing tight. He collapsed to his knees, struggling to breathe. But Damien didn't even move. "You cannot win. This is my destiny." And then, in that final moment, Richard saw something in the boy's eyes, a flicker of weakness, doubt. Summoning all his strength, he lunged forward with the dagger. The blade gleamed in the dim light. Richard lunged forward, driving the dagger straight toward Damien's chest, but at the last moment, something invisible threw him back. He slammed into the wall, feeling his ribs crack from the impact. Damien stood motionless. "I told you," he said quietly. "You can't do it." His eyes turned pitch black, and the shadow behind him began to expand, as if something vast and terrifying was lurking within him. The lamp flickered and went out. A dreadful whisper filled the house, speaking words Richard didn't understand. But they made his blood run cold. He tried to rise, but an unseen force pinned him to the floor. "You're just a man," Damien continued, "and I am more." The darkness thickened, becoming almost alive. But then the door burst open, and David Keller stormed into the room. In his hands he held a silver cross. "Back, demon!" he shouted. For a moment Damien recoiled, his face twisting in fury. The darkness wavered. It was enough. Richard gathered the last of his strength, grabbed the dagger, and lunged one final time. The blade plunged into the boy's chest. Damien screamed. The house trembled. Windows shattered into tiny shards, and the unseen force dissipated like smoke. Richard stood, gasping for breath, staring at his son. Damien was still alive. He looked up at him with those black, endless eyes. "You made a mistake, Father," he whispered, his lips curling into a smile. Damien lay on the floor, the dagger still embedded in his chest. But he was smiling. Richard felt terror consume him. How are you still alive?" The boy slowly raised his hand and touched the blade. His eyes burned with dark fire. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive," he whispered. The room trembled. Darkness began to gather again, but this time it was larger, stronger. The ceiling cracked, the walls split apart, covered in black fractures, as if the house itself was falling apart. David Keller stepped back, gripping the cross tightly. "We need to get out of here." But Richard couldn't move. His hands were shaking. "This has to end." He wrenched the dagger from Damien's chest and raised it above his head, ready to strike the final blow. But then something horrifying happened. From the darkness, a massive shadow emerged, black as the abyss itself. It wrapped around Damien, lifting him into the air. The boy's eyes glowed red. "You lost, Father," he whispered. "You never had a chance." And in that moment Richard understood the terrible truth. Damien was not just a boy. He was the beginning. He was the inevitable. He was the end of everything, the finale. The house began to collapse. David grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him toward the exit. "There's nothing we can do. He's too strong." They ran out just seconds before the roof caved in. Black smoke rose into the sky, and in the midst of the destruction, standing at the very center of it all, was Damien, unharmed, smiling. His eyes were no longer the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of a beast. "Soon," he whispered, "the whole world will be mine." And then Richard knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning.